While you're being told to communicate better and express your needs more clearly, a Roman emperor who commanded the loyalty of 60 million people already solved the exact problem you're facing in your relationship 1,800 years ago. Marcus Aurelius didn't rule through force, he ruled through presence. Through an internal architecture so precisely calibrated that external chaos, enemy invasions, political betrayal, plague sweeping his empire, couldn't penetrate his strategic composure. And here's what nobody tells you in couples therapy or relationship coaching. That same architecture is exactly what's missing from your approach to love, respect, and personal power. You've been handed communication scripts when you needed a mental fortress. You've been sold vulnerability tactics when you required sovereignty principles. And you've been told your problem is that you're not expressing yourself enough, when the real issue is that you haven't built the internal structure that makes your expression magnetically undeniable. Marcus Aurelius ruled the Roman Empire at its absolute territorial peak from 161 to 180 AD. Not through dominance games, not through emotional manipulation, through a leadership philosophy so sophisticated that it transformed every attack into raw material for greater strength. While barbarian armies pressed his borders and senators plotted his downfall, he documented a mental system in his private journals, writings never meant for publication, that accidentally became the most powerful guide to personal mastery ever written. He called it living according to nature. We call it Stoicism. But here's what they don't teach you in relationship courses. This wasn't passive acceptance. This was active transformation. This was the exact opposite of the work on yourself advice that leaves you exhausted and still unappreciated. Every relationship dynamic you're navigating right now, feeling invisible despite giving everything, watching your boundaries get tested, then trampled, questioning whether you're asking for too much when you're actually accepting too little, Marcus faced the leadership equivalent on a scale that would crush most humans. He didn't survive by compromising his values. He dominated by clarifying them so completely that wavering became impossible. The three-part framework he used remains largely untranslatable in modern relationship advice because it requires something contemporary psychology actively discourages: absolute sovereignty over your internal state regardless of external validation. Most relationship experts need you dependent on techniques. Marcus built women and men who needed nothing but became everything. This is why his approach changes everything for the sophisticated woman tired of performing emotional labor while receiving conditional respect. Because while modern relationship gurus sell you better communication tactics, he documented the precise mental architecture that makes you inherently commanding. Not through effort, through presence, calibrated at a level most people never discover exists.
Let me guess. You've read the relationship books, tried the communication frameworks, practiced the vulnerability scripts, and you're still hitting the same invisible ceiling in your partnerships. You show up fully. You communicate your needs clearly. You try to create space for authentic connection, and somehow you still end up feeling like you're managing his emotions, justifying your boundaries, or wondering why the respect you give isn't the respect you receive. You've done the work: therapy, journaling, those brutally honest conversations at 2 in the morning, and yet the fundamental dynamic stays maddeningly the same. Here's what nobody tells you. You're not failing. You're operating inside a system designed to keep you reactive. The entire relationship advice industry profits from giving you techniques that treat symptoms, while the underlying structure stays perfectly intact. They sell you better communication when the real problem is that you're communicating from a position that was never architecturally sound to begin with. This is the triple bind sophisticated women face in modern relationships. First, you're expected to do the invisible emotional labor: track his feelings, manage the household mental load, remember his mother's birthday, anticipate needs before they're spoken. Second, you're told that if you want respect, you need to ask for it more clearly, as if the issue is your articulation rather than his attention. Third, when you finally establish a boundary, you're met with resistance that makes you question whether you're being unreasonable for wanting what should be baseline reciprocity. So you try the solutions. You over-prepare for difficult conversations, rehearsing your points so they can't be dismissed. You adjust your tone, not too emotional, not too cold, finding that impossible middle ground between authentic and palatable. You read about attachment styles and love languages and emotional bids, hoping the right framework will finally crack the code. You play the game exactly as they tell you to play it. And he still checks his phone while you're sharing something vulnerable. Your boundaries still get tested like they're suggestions rather than requirements. That thing you mentioned needing 3 months ago still hasn't happened, but somehow his needs get addressed immediately. You watch yourself shrinking, accommodating, managing his reactions to your perfectly reasonable requests, and you wonder when you became this person. When you prepare for a serious conversation for hours, thinking through every angle, anticipating his responses, trying to make your case airtight, and he walks in completely unprepared, dismisses your concerns in 5 minutes, and somehow you end up comforting him about how hard it is to hear criticism. When you're the one who remembers every detail of his life, while he can't recall the basic timeline of yours. When you realize you've become the relationship's project manager and he's the consultant who shows up when convenient. The voice in your head starts questioning everything. Maybe I'm too sensitive. Maybe I'm asking for too much. Maybe this is just how relationships are and I need to be more grateful. Maybe if I just explain it one more way, he'll finally understand. That voice, the one making you doubt your own perception, isn't wisdom. It's conditioning, and it's exactly what keeps you trapped in this cycle. Here's what makes this especially insidious. The advice you're getting treats you as the variable that needs adjustment. Be more confident in stating your needs. Practice self-care so you're not resentful. Work on your communication style. As if you're the malfunctioning component in a system that's working exactly as designed to keep you performing emotional labor while questioning whether you deserve rest. Marcus Aurelius identified this pattern in 167 AD. He called it confusing motion for progress. All that effort, all that emotional output, all those conversations that feel like progress in the moment, but leave the fundamental dynamic untouched. He faced the leadership equivalent when he inherited the Roman Empire at age 40. Advisors who saw him as a figurehead, senators who openly questioned his authority, and a court that expected him to be malleable. They treated him like his role was to validate their importance, not to actually lead. But Marcus didn't respond by trying to prove himself through their metrics. He didn't work twice as hard to earn respect that should have been inherent to his position. He didn't adjust his personality to become more palatable to men who were never going to respect him on their terms. He built a diagnostic system that revealed exactly where his leverage actually existed. And that system, that precise Stoic architecture, is what you're missing. Not another communication technique, not another framework for understanding his perspective, but the internal structure that makes proving yourself completely unnecessary because your presence becomes undeniable. You're about to learn exactly how he did it.
Marcus Aurelius didn't write Meditations to inspire you. He wrote it to survive leading an empire that was actively collapsing while maintaining absolute sovereignty over the one thing that mattered, his internal state. Here's the reality they don't teach you when they quote him on Instagram over sunset photos. Marcus inherited the Roman Empire in 161 AD at age 40, and immediately everything fell apart. The Parthian War erupted in the east. The Antonine Plague swept through Rome, killing 5 million people, roughly 10% of the empire's population.
Germanic tribes pushed across the northern borders. The economy was collapsing. His co-emperor died. Advisors who'd served under his predecessor treated him like an inexperienced figurehead who needed constant management. And instead of collapsing under the weight of impossible circumstances, he documented exactly how to build unshakable internal authority when external validation is absent, inconsistent, or actively hostile. These weren't published philosophical treatises. These were private war journals written in Greek, a language he chose deliberately because it forced precision. They weren't discovered and circulated until centuries after his death. What you're reading when you encounter Meditations is the internal strategic architecture of a man managing complexity on a scale that would shatter most humans, written never expecting anyone else would see his process. This matters for you because the sophistication required to maintain your sense of self while navigating modern relationship dynamics, where you're expected to be endlessly available yet mysteriously independent, emotionally open yet never needy, assertive about boundaries yet always accommodating, requires the exact same architectural thinking Marcus developed. You're not managing 60 million subjects across 3 continents. But you are managing the impossible mathematics of maintaining your identity while building intimacy, setting boundaries while staying connected, commanding respect while remaining approachable, integrating career ambition with relationship presence, and doing all of this while the culture gives you contradictory instructions at every turn. Marcus understood something that modern relationship advice fundamentally misses. You cannot manage complexity through personality adjustments. You need systematic philosophy, not theory, practical architecture. He studied under 8 philosophy masters before taking the throne. He was immersed in Stoicism, a school of thought founded by Zeno of Citium in 300 BC that was the opposite of passive acceptance. Stoicism was and is the philosophy of strategic action. While Epicureans focused on pleasure and Cynics advocated withdrawal from society, Stoics developed a framework for maintaining power and clarity while fully engaged in the chaos. The core innovation Marcus brought was applying these principles to maximum responsibility contexts. He ruled for 19 years through constant crisis, multiple wars, plague, political betrayal, the weight of millions depending on his decisions, and he maintained both military dominance and philosophical innovation simultaneously. His secret wasn't suppressing emotion or pretending nothing bothered him. It was building an internal system so architecturally sound that external chaos couldn't penetrate his strategic composure. He developed what Stoics called prohairesis, reasoned choice, the capacity to direct your will regardless of circumstances. He mastered amor fati, not just accepting what happens, but actively transforming obstacles into raw material for greater strength. While plague ravaged Rome and barbarian armies pressed his borders, Marcus was writing about how to maintain clarity when everything around you is chaos, how to command respect when people are actively undermining your authority, how to stay sovereign when everyone wants you to be reactive. Sound familiar? So what did he discover in those war journals that applies to your next difficult conversation, your next boundary violation, your next moment of questioning whether you're asking for too much? 3 architectural principles that flip everything.
The Aurelius architecture has 3 parts. Master all 3, and relationship obstacles don't just become manageable, they become your unfair advantage. This isn't about communicating better or understanding his perspective more deeply. This is about building internal sovereignty so complete that external validation becomes irrelevant, and yet paradoxically, respect becomes inevitable. Marcus documented this system across 12 books of private journals while managing an empire in crisis. You're about to learn how to apply it to the relationship dynamics that have exhausted every other approach you've tried. Principle 1. The perception pivot. Marcus wrote in Book 2 of Meditations, "Choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed. don't feel harmed, and you haven't been. This sounds like toxic positivity until you understand what he actually meant. He's not telling you to pretend violations don't hurt. He's teaching you to change what the violation means, to pivot from victim of circumstance to strategist extracting intelligence. Here's the application. When he dismisses your boundary for the third time, most relationship advice tells you to communicate it more clearly, as if the problem is your articulation. The Stoic approach is radically different. His dismissal just gave you critical strategic information about his capacity for respect. That's not harm, that's reconnaissance. When you share something vulnerable and he responds by checking his phone, you're not experiencing rejection that requires you to be less vulnerable next time. You're gathering data about his attention architecture. When that difficult conversation you prepared for gets derailed by his defensiveness, you haven't failed. You've just learned exactly where his emotional range ends. The perception pivot transforms every relationship obstacle from evidence of your inadequacy into strategic intelligence about the system you're operating within. Most women internalize these moments. What did I do wrong? How can I be better? Stoics externalize strategically. What did this reveal? How do I use this information? You hear, you're too sensitive, and instead of questioning your emotional calibration, you recognize you're dealing with someone who weaponizes your depth as a deflection from their shallowness. That's not a character flaw in you. That's strategic information about their capacity. You hear, why do you always bring up old stuff when you reference a pattern? And instead of doubting your memory, you note that he cannot track behavioral sequences. That's actionable intelligence. Marcus faced advisors who smiled to his face while undermining his military strategies behind his back. He didn't waste energy trying to make them loyal. He recognized their betrayal as information about who could be trusted with what level of responsibility, and he reorganized his command structure accordingly. He transformed treachery into organizational clarity. The tactical practice. Before any difficult conversation, spend 60 seconds in observer mind. Not preparing your points, that's anxiety. Instead, anchor yourself in this frame. I'm about to gather intelligence about this relationship's capacity. Whatever happens reveals truth. You'll feel the shift immediately when you stop needing the conversation to go well and start using it as strategic reconnaissance. Principle 2. The locus of power. This is the centerpiece of Stoic philosophy and the principle most misunderstood in modern application. The dichotomy of control isn't about accepting powerlessness. It's about ruthlessly identifying where your actual leverage exists and flooding that space with your energy. Here's what women can control in relationship dynamics: the quality of your boundaries, your strategic response to violations, the documentation of patterns, your emotional sovereignty, your exit strategy preparation, the clarity of your requirements, the consistency of your standards. Here's what women cannot control: his level of emotional development, his willingness to do his own therapeutic work, systemic conditioning he absorbed about male entitlement, his family's dysfunction that shaped his relationship template, whether he chooses growth or comfort, his timeline for recognizing your value. Marcus couldn't control that plague killed 5 million Romans. He could control Rome's medical response infrastructure, grain distribution during crisis, and military positioning during population collapse. He didn't spend philosophical energy lamenting the plague's existence. He spent strategic energy on the variables he could actually move. Most relationship advice keeps you focused on the wrong variables. Better communication, that's trying to control his receptivity. Explaining your needs more clearly, that's trying to control his willingness to prioritize you. Managing your tone so he doesn't get defensive, that's trying to control his emotional regulation. Stop spending energy there. The energy reallocation is this: stop trying to convince him you deserve respect. Start demonstrating through action that respect is your baseline requirement. Stop managing his comfort with your boundaries. Start enforcing consequences when boundaries are violated. Stop explaining why something hurt you. Start tracking whether he changes behavior after you've named harm. You cannot control whether he interrupts you. You can control whether you continue speaking as if he hadn't, training him through consistency that his interruption is irrelevant to your completion of thought. You cannot control whether he remembers what's important to you. You can control whether you continue performing emotional labor for someone who doesn't reciprocate basic attention. Marcus wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength." Every ounce of energy you spend trying to make him understand is energy not spent building your internal fortress. He doesn't need to understand. You need to be unshakable in what you require. The women who transform their relationship dynamics aren't the ones who finally find the right words. They're the ones who reallocate energy from convincing to demonstrating, from explaining to deciding, from hoping to observing and acting accordingly. Principle 3. The action hierarchy. Marcus ruled 60 million people and commanded 30 legions across multiple war fronts simultaneously. He couldn't do everything, so he built a filter that appears throughout meditations. Is this essential? 60% of what you're doing in your relationship isn't strategic, it's anxiety masquerading as care. You're managing his emotions, anticipating his needs, smoothing social dynamics, remembering details he should track himself, explaining your perspective 17 different ways, doing emotional labor that creates the illusion of progress while the fundamental dynamic stays identical. Women are conditioned to manage everyone's comfort. Stoicism teaches you to manage toward your actual objective. These are opposite things. The essential action filter works like this. Does this action move me toward the relationship dynamic I require, or does it just reduce tension temporarily? Does this conversation build respect infrastructure, or does it just manage his reaction to my needs? Is this boundary enforcement, or is this boundary explanation for the 5th time? Marcus couldn't defend every border simultaneously. He identified which fronts were essential to Rome's survival and which were secondary. He didn't scatter resources, he concentrated force where it mattered. You cannot maintain boundaries, perform emotional labor, pursue your own goals, manage household administration, track his needs, and explain yourself constantly. You'll collapse under the distribution of effort. The question isn't, how do I do it all? The question is, what actually creates the relationship dynamic I require? Everything else is negotiable or eliminable. Marcus asked this daily during the Marcomannic Wars when Germanic tribes pushed across the Danube. What is the essential action right now? Not the action that feels productive, not the action that reduces immediate anxiety, the action that moves toward strategic victory. For you, this might mean stop explaining why his behavior hurts and start implementing consequences. Stop doing the emotional labor that lets him avoid growth. Stop managing the relationship's temperature and start requiring him to co-regulate. Stop proving your worth and start observing whether he recognizes it unprompted. Now, here's where it gets practical, because philosophy without implementation is just intellectual entertainment, and you need results.
Philosophy you don't practice is just entertainment, so here's exactly how to install the Aurelius architecture into your actual relationship life this week. Morning Stoic Protocol, 10 minutes. Before you touch your phone, before you respond to anyone's needs, you build your internal fortress. Marcus did this in a war tent while barbarian armies gathered at the border. You can do this before your day begins. Premeditatio malorum, premeditation of adversity. Visualize the likely obstacles today. He might be dismissive when you bring up that thing again. Your boundary might get tested. You might feel that familiar pull to over-explain yourself. You're not catastrophizing. You're removing surprise's power. When it happens, you'll recognize it as expected rather than destabilizing. Locus of power scan. Mentally list what you actually control today versus what you don't. You control whether you enforce your boundary consistently. You don't control whether he likes it. You control your emotional sovereignty. You don't control his timeline for growth. This 60-second scan reallocates energy
before you waste it. Essential action identification. What is the one thing that moves you toward the relationship you require? Not the 17 things that reduce temporary tension. The one essential action. Maybe it's implementing a consequence. Maybe it's not doing his emotional labor today. Maybe it's documenting a pattern you've been excusing. Name it. Commit to it. Pre-conversation pivot. Before any difficult conversation, activate observer mind. Say internally, I am gathering strategic intelligence about this relationship's capacity. Whatever happens reveals truth. You're not entering to convince or to be validated. You're entering to observe and extract data. Set bias expectation. I expect resistance to my boundary. This gives me information, not evidence that my boundary is wrong. When you expect the pattern, you stop being destabilized by it. Daily action filter, 15 minutes evening. Marcus asked himself 3 questions every night and they changed his leadership. Adapt them now. What did I do well today? Where did I maintain sovereignty despite pressure? This builds evidence of your capacity. What could improve? Where did I slip into old patterns? Over-explaining, managing his emotions, abandoning my boundary when he pushed back. What was non-essential? This is the revolution. How much energy did you spend on his comfort, his emotional regulation, convincing him you're reasonable? That's energy that didn't move you toward the relationship you require. Energy audit. What drained you that you cannot control? His reaction to your needs, his willingness to meet you halfway, his defensiveness. What energized you that you can control? Holding your boundary, speaking truth without managing his response, choosing yourself. Tomorrow's essential action. The one thing that moves your empire forward. Not people-pleasing, not explaining, not hoping, acting. Weekly strategic review. Pattern recognition. Where did obstacles reveal information? His repeated dismissal isn't random, it's data about respect capacity. Use it. Locus recalibration. Where did you waste energy trying to control his choices, his growth, his timeline? Redirect that energy to your sovereignty. Architecture refinement. What needs systemic change versus one-time conversation? You can't conversation your way out of structural disrespect. You need architectural shifts. This isn't about adding more to your plate. It's about finally having a system that tells you what to take off. The emotional labor that isn't reciprocated, the explanations that never land, the hope that substitutes for observation. Women who implement the action hierarchy report dropping 30 to 40% of their emotional labor with dramatically better relationship dynamics. Not because they communicated better, because they stopped spending energy on non-essential territory and concentrated force where it matters, their own unshakable standards. Start with the morning protocol only. Add the rest when it feels automatic. Marcus built Rome's defense infrastructure one strategic decision at a time. You're building sovereignty architecture the same way. This is how philosophy becomes practical power, and that changes everything. Here's what happens next.
So here's your fork in the road. Most women will watch this, feel inspired, and change nothing. You're not most women. You watched this far, you're already different. You're done with surface solutions that keep you explaining, accommodating, shrinking. Tomorrow morning, 10 minutes. Premeditate adversity. Identify your locus. Choose the essential action. That's day 1. Marcus Aurelius ruled for 19 years using this exact system. Your next 19 days will prove whether it translates to relationship power. It does. Only 2 to 5% will actually implement. That's your cohort. Join the women who've stopped trying to be understood and started being undeniable. The relationship dynamic didn't shift because you asked nicely.
This framework teaches you to architect it, starting now. This is yours.